Would you please be seated? And it's a great pleasure to welcome our Treasurer and Churchwarden, Ian Dixon, to preach for us this morning. This is a delayed sermon and probably subject changed from our Lent series, when of course our normal sermon series was kicked into a cocked hat. So thank you, welcome Ian, lovely to have you in the pulpit.
Thank you, George. Well, I never expected to be standing here at this point in the service, and no doubt none of you expected it either, so it's a bit of a surprise to both of us. Can I just start by dispelling one rumour? One is that the only reason I accepted the invitation was so I could take the face mask off. But if anyone else wanted to volunteer, I'm sure you'd be pleased to hear from you. Or you could join the choir, I suppose, or you could read the lesson. But I'm very grateful for that anyway. The other thing was that when I sort of addressed this address, and I hesitate to say I'm preaching at you, but when I directed this address at my bathroom mirror yesterday, I did put the watch on to see how long it was going to take, and can confidently predict that it'll be done in less than an hour. But as I said, I never. I was thinking about what could we talk about today, and it got me thinking about that word never. It's a little word that we use quite often, but it does have some quite significance in some aspects of our lives. And it got me thinking about a variety of situations that I've encountered in my lifetime where the word never came up. And one which particularly came to mind took me back some 58 years to my first few weeks in my banking career. Some of you, I'm sure perhaps most of you, will remember the days of passbooks for your banking details. And in fact, some places still do passbooks. But back in those days, before computerisation, amazingly enough, everybody that had a savings account in the bank used to have a passbook, and all the entries were written up in the passbook. And they started off in this huge ledger, and then as a junior clerk, you were given the onerous task of copying them all out of the ledger into the passbooks when your customers handed their books in. Well, that was one of my very early jobs to do, and most people, it didn't take too long because things didn't happen that often. But one particular customer, Lady Ordington, who I think I can name because she must be dead by now. Lady Ordington had a load of investments, and when you got to Lady Ordington's book, there are about 4 pages of dividends from all the companies that she'd invested in. And it took ages, and so I meticulously copied all these things through, put them in the book, and as I got to the end of the book, I thought, I've put all of the credits in the debit column. But you really don't want to write all out again, so I very neatly put a bracket round the column and arrowed it across. I thought, creative, that'll do the job, and thought no more of it, until a few weeks later, the manager called me into his office, and who was sitting there but Lady Ordington, and on the desk was the passbook. Well, what's happened here, of course, says the manager. And I said, it's an easy mistake to make, you know. And indeed, in my defence, the new sort of books that we're using do have it the other way round. But I thought it was a rather neat way of doing it. Well, they said, you know what you've got to do now, Mr. Dixon, don't you? And I sort of guessed what was coming. Yes, he said, I think you'll just start a whole new book for Lady Ordington, covering all of the entries, including the ones that you put in the wrong column, and that should deal with it. Which wasn't good news, but at least it sort of drew it to a conclusion. But the bit that I remembered really was what he said as I was leaving. If this is how you started your banking career, Mr. Dixon, you will never make a success of it.
Oh.
So that was a never that stuck with me for a long time. And of course, there've been quite a few others as well along the way. First one I think I recall was me when I was about 4 years old. I'll never eat Brussels sprouts again. And then as a teenager, my mates at the youth club, you'll never get to go out with her.
Oh.
And then as we were applying for our first mortgage, my mum saying to me, you'll never be out of debt. And then later in years, me to my son, you'll never pass your 11 plus unless you work harder. And as I said it was like history repeating itself, you know. And later again, me to my wife, our son will never get married as the years are going by. And again, whilst later on in my working life, colleagues saying to me, well, you'll never be able to set up your own business. And quite a few nevers there. All that sort of came to mind when I started to think about situations where that word had come into play. And of course there are others where we come across that word. I watched a documentary a few weeks ago that was actually all about the Dunkirk evacuation. And one of the things that struck me about that was that one of the guys that had survived all of that, he said, you know, we never thought we would see England again. And you can understand that feeling, can't you? And then that reminded me of, I hope I've got this right, Mr. Churchill. We shall never surrender, I seem to recall. And one that crossed my mind only this morning, straight enough, which was that very quiet-mannered Protestant priest in Northern Ireland, who I think were talking about working together with the Catholics, when I think he said, never, never, never. I think that's what he was talking about. But it just got me thinking, yeah, there was a never that was very much in evidence. And of course this week actually I was reminded that it's 19 years on from when the Twin Towers were destroyed. And people at the time were saying, we never thought we would see anything like that. And of course even more recently, we'll never leave Europe. That was 48% of the population who said that. So I guess what's important about never is how we react to it. And sometimes it can be a spur to better things. Sometimes it's an expression of hope that whatever it is never happens. Sometimes it's just a statement of what we feel at a particular time. That comment from my manager did sort of spur me on to become qualified and I think and I hope to be reasonably okay in my banking career. I managed a number of branches amongst other things, so it didn't turn out too badly. I actually did get to go out with that young lady and we were married some years later, but then I was always one for persevering. And we did pay off the mortgage eventually, but not that we had much choice about that one. My son did pass his 11 plus, amazingly, so something seemed to have worked there. And he did get married, and as it happens, today is his wedding anniversary. So I think, like me, he also persevered somewhat. I ignored the advice from the work colleagues, and I did set up my own business around 20 years ago. And strangely enough, I saw the other side of never there, because a great friend of mine at the time said to me, if you don't do it now, you never will. And I think we've probably all heard things like that in our lives as well. And going back to that evacuation at Dunkirk, you know, many of them thought they'd never see England again, but an awful lot of them did. Of course, we didn't surrender either. The Twin Towers still lives long in the memory, and as we say, we hope we never see the like of that again. Oh, and the other thing is that I think we actually are leaving Europe, but that remains to be seen. So, all of these events, some are very minor and trivial, some very significant, influenced in some way, I think, by faith and by hope. Faith in your own abilities on occasions, faith in oneself by other people on other occasions, and hope that some of those situations would never be repeated or indeed would never happen. Now, last week Tim spoke to us about the importance of loving our neighbour and the emphasis placed on this throughout the New Testament. In Corinthians, we're reminded of faith, hope and love, and the greatest of these is love. Well, far be it from me to challenge this, but having listened to a few wedding addresses, I do feel that love gets a good deal of attention, and I want to raise a glass, as it were, to faith and hope. In these challenging times, I believe that both faith and hope are just as much required as indeed is love. Yes, we've seen many instances of love for our fellow man in the kindness and the generosity displayed throughout the pandemic. But for many, it's the hope that we see an end to it and the faith that an end will come that keeps us strong. Now, in our Old Testament reading today, we hear of the instructions for the Passover, an event that was to enable the Israelites to leave Egypt. Now, my research on this tells me that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. Now, you can't tell me that there weren't a few Israelites who during that time said, we're never going to get out of Egypt. And indeed, when the time came for some serious intervention from God, Moses was 80 and Aaron was 83. So I'm pretty sure they could be forgiven for thinking that nothing was going to change. They would never get out of Egypt in their lifetimes. And as you know, there are a whole series of plagues descended upon the Egyptians in an effort to get Pharaoh to let them go. Frogs, locusts, gnats, flies, to name but a few. But none of these did the job. And again, Moses and Aaron must be forgiven for thinking, it's never going to happen. Eventually God steps it up a few notches and explains that the firstborn will all be destroyed. But the Israelites would be okay if they follow some instructions. Now, after the failure of all the plagues, there must have been a few who questioned the guidance. Probably not very dissimilar to where we are today in some ways. The fact of the matter is that they did follow the guidance, even though they might have thought it will never work. This, I believe, required tremendous faith and not a little hope. Love looked to be a bit lower down the list on that particular occasion. So moving to the New Testament, just think about Mary and Joseph getting the news of the virgin birth. They never thought that would happen. But Mary showed tremendous faith in accepting the situation. I expect that for Joseph, he rather hoped that no one would notice. Many of the incidents recorded in the Gospels tell of individuals who demonstrated great faith. Your faith has made you whole, and similar comments were something Jesus said on a number of occasions. Our second reading again reminds us to love your neighbour as yourself. Why? Because, and I quote, our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is nearly over, the day is almost here. Perhaps further guidelines to be ready, for who knows when the second coming might happen. Never say never. And our gospel reading gives guidance on dealing with those who sin against us. I'm not too sure about treating them like a Gentile or a tax collector. And whilst I have had many dealings with HMRC, and I've some sympathy with that view, I think perhaps we should be reverting a bit more to the love thy neighbour entreaty when we perhaps look at that passage. But at the end of it, it intrigued me to read that, however we are told, if two of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. Now, that's another one of those things that requires an act of faith and, no doubt, quite a bit of hope as well. It seems to me that the bottom line here is that faith and hope have just as an important part to play, not only in our day-to-day lives, but as we pursue our Christian journey. Sometimes that faith will be tested and our hopes may not be fulfilled. But it does seem that things can and do happen when God decides to get involved. The timing may not always agree with us, but things do happen. Much of the faith we place in ourselves and others, and in the hopes that we have, relies simply on us. This faith and some of the hopes can fade and even disappear. But faith in God is a steadfast thing. It's always there when you need it and is unchanging. Going back to that documentary about Dunkirk, I recalled another comment from one of the veterans. There were no atheists on that beach that day. Clearly faith and hope were very much in evidence in that situation, and for many of them they were rewarded. Might have been the last hope for some, but it was still there to be accessed, steadfast and unchanging. We recently celebrated, or in America they celebrated Martin Luther King Day. Martin Luther King had a dream, a hope for a better future. May not have been fulfilled yet, but it seems that maybe times are changing as the mood of the global population changes a bit. And as we look for a more caring society as an outcome of the pandemic, we've also seen so many more acts of kindness and love for our neighbours in recent months. Perhaps this is the Holy Spirit working amongst us. I asked Judith actually if our hymn today could be God is working his purpose out, which I suspect many of you are familiar with. I think the words there say a lot about maintaining faith in God and hope for the future. The last verse says, all we can do is nothing worth unless God blesses the deed. Vainly we hope for the harvest tide till God gives life to the seed. I think that tells us something about being patient, and you might like to revisit the words of that hymn yourself sometime. Now, next week the PCC meet, and top of the agenda will be the new building project at St Bartholomew's. The cost is significant, as you know, won't be surprised to hear. And I did share this with someone in our parish a little while ago, who's not a regular churchgoer. It's going to be quite a challenge, I said. Well, he replied, you need to have faith. Isn't that what Christianity is all about? And finally, I did have Brussels sprouts again when I was about 50. So like I said, never say never. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Ian. That was very good. A bit too good, actually. We'll have you up there again, Ian. Lovely to hear about the persistence of faith and hope. As you were talking there, Ian, it reminded me of whoever it was that said, it'll all be all right in the end. And if it isn't all right, it isn't the end. So lovely to hear of the younger and less mentioned siblings of love, faith and hope. Thank you very much, Ian, for your word. So with that in mind, let's stand to affirm our faith.